7 minutes later, another week later, today, 4 days later, limited time only again, previously again, meanwhile, at the robot line later, at today very boring then approximately 1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion paranoia billion years later, 7 weeks later, 9 weeks later, many days later, 4 hours later, 1 hour and 39 minutes later. Meanwhile, 9 books later, happy second anniversary. 12 months later, sometime later. 9 unbearable hours later, you win the idea. Several hours later,
Approximately 9 minutes later. Later that tomorrow. 7 very boring days later. 3 minutes later. Many moments later. A few weeks later.
a few months later,
7 hours and 7 weeks later.
25 years later, 11 hours later, the next Friday, 6 to 8 hours later, 8 to 12 minutes later, 3 to 5.5 moments later, several scary minutes later, a little longer than a few weeks later, the next week, 4 minutes later, several tic-tacs later, a little longer than a few seconds later, several weeks later, the following Monday, 9 more days later, several years later, a few flowers later, several weekends later, a today very boring then approximately 3 eternities later. After Doris fell asleep, a little longer than a few inches later, 3 minutes later, more hours later, a few moments later, 5 weeks later, the next night, a little longer than a few pants later, 4 to 6 minutes later, after Doris fell asleep, day 5, day 6, day 7, 7 to 9 hours later, 9 to 11 months later, 6.5 minutes later, a little longer than a few days later, 2,000 hours later, 8.5 inches later, 35 weeks later, 4 seconds later, 5 seconds later,
15 seconds later. 40 inventions later. A ton of weeks later. Many weeks later. 200 minutes later. Many unbearable minutes later. 60 minutes later. 4,000 centuries later. 2 minutes earlier. Meanwhile, when it's still going.
Meanwhile, still, 16 hours later, 9 paranoia-filled minutes later, 13 minutes later, 67 seconds later, the following Monday, a little longer than a few months later, 20 days later, 7:20 a.m., 5 centuries later, 6 decades later, a few centuries later, the next day, 100 minutes later, 7 seconds later, a few decades later. Meanwhile, that seemed weeks. Meanwhile, that evening, approximately 17 seconds later. Meanwhile, that night, 70 months later. 1 hour of making a new school later. 74 seconds later. Later, at the Krusty Krab. 23 minutes later. Many centuries later. 9 decades later. 500 minutes later. 6 minutes later. After Doris fell asleep. 14 months later. Many attempts to fix the house later. Day after tomorrow. 1 month later, 15 months later, several long weeks later, many dogs later, 1 week later, 2 months later, 6 days later, 5,000 crazy months later, 90,000 years later, a few angry moments later, 7:30 p.m., 86 days later, the very next day, many decades later, 2 days later, many unbearable minutes later, a few moments later, 95 days later, 9 months later, 2 hours later, 85 seconds later, 1 week later, 45 minutes later, 1 hour later, 8 minutes later, 2 moons later, 6 plates later, 8 seconds later, many musical notes later.
So, what is... minutes later.
Later still.
More later.
The next morning. The next day. The next day. One soggy week later. The next day in a parallel universe. Many attempts to fix the past later. Many folks later. The next day. One missing later, the next night. Meanwhile, a lot of pleasure later. 99 hours later, 678 pickles later. Game montage. 7 hours ago, 4 hats later. 5 love songs later. 13 invasions later. 3 days later. 10 hours later. Several minutes later. Many moments later, 1 day later, many years later.
So 500 minutes, many attempts to fix the gifts, 9 books, 298 frozen patties, 1,000 of tears, stupid early the next morning, 1 second, a lot of screaming, 90,000 hours of fun term, 15 months, new one. Meanwhile, back in the Monday, tomorrow for right. Power for short. Afternoon 4, afternoon 5, afternoon 6, 1 trillion fireworks later. That the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one today for right. Today again, 80 minutes seriously, 21 minutes later, after Pinky arrived on the moon. Several song-filled minutes later, 765,000 years later, 2,000 years later, 3 days seriously, a today, very boring, then a few inches later, after Yaroslav fell asleep on 2:57 a.m., when Pinky and Yaroslav Messi arrived at Red Paint at the Place, after Dennis and Era calling bowling, after Pinky and Wenda calling bowl when bowl will ground her.
1 hour later.
Okay. Oh. Whoa. That's good.
1 week later. Many miles later. The next morning. 1 bus ride later. Several hours later.
Looking for the perfect Amharic voice keyboard? Experience the ultimate voice keyboard. Simply speak and watch your words appear.
1 extremely annoying hour later. 90 hours later. When temperature grew in the 7th sea.
وعلى بعد أمتار وعلى بعد أمتار وعلى بعد أمتار وعلى بعد أمتار
1 minute. Right. I'm sorry. I'm crazy. Who? 2 extremely annoying hour later.
Hey!
Ooh, 90 hours later. While temperature grew in the 7 seas.
وعلى بعد أمتار 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 وعلى بعد أمتار
Max, you want to download this watch? Look, this and this. I want to download this. I'll download it.
I like it.
وعلى بعد أمتار
You don't like it? 18 hours later. One scary hours later. Many hours of sexting with television later. Many hours of sexting with television later. One box
I want to
later.
download it already.
28 hours later, Boeing 70. Look, you download 28 hours later, Boeing 70.
What?
8 minutes later. You download this, look. A full of package hours later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 5 hours later. Look, a few moments later.
Hey!
Let me tell you. 15 minutes ago. Okay, what? This one you done it?
Yep.
200 kajillion potatoes later.
808 impershoots later.
No? Why?
It does not tell me. No! That's different!
3:28 a.m.
100 spatulas later. 8,205 minutes later. 80 desserts later.
Nine 1,380 cookies
Ew.
later.
9,008,001 seconds later. 98 hours later.
Meanwhile in Merquisive, multiple cups of coffee later, one heartbeat scene later, I don't know how much time later, a few moments later after the previously mentioned a few moments later, 2 YouTube ads later, 1 poorly fitted template later, 15 seconds later, 3 really pointless hours later.
Vibing with your friends, but your soft pad is bringing wetness? Switch to new Always Skin Love.
5:02 p.m.
I didn't download that. It's so small.
A ton of my legs later. My leg! Shut up, Fred. 365 terrible drawings later. 19 homework-filled weeks later. 10 years later. 7 seconds later. See next line.
What, which
Later
one?
that same October's morning. A little longer than a few flowers later. A few pants later. Later.
3 hours later,
Nothing.
5 days
Nothing.
later, 6 hours later, 10 minutes,
Okay, no.
3 hours later, 5 days later, 6 hours later, 10 minutes later, 9 minutes later, meanwhile, 10 minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 months later, many weeks later, 7 days later, 8 hours later, 1.25 seconds later, not even 2 minutes later, 2 minutes later, 1 hour later, weeks later, 7 days later, 8 hours hours later, 1.25 seconds later, not even 2 minutes later, 2 minutes later, 1 hour later, 30 minutes later, 25 minutes later, 20 minutes later, 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later, 4 hours later, 9 weeks later, many minutes later, 3 days later, 6 months later, 25 minutes later, 6 weeks later, 29 minutes later, 45 minutes later, the next morning, 5 minutes later, many scientists later, hours later, 22 minutes later, a few minutes later, 1 hour later, 30 minutes later, 6 hours later, 3 hours later, 1 month later, 97 minutes later, 24 hours later, 2 hours later, 50 minutes later, 25 minutes later, 10 hours later, 9 hours later, many hours later, 1 idiot later, 6 hours later,
1 week later, 1 million milliseconds later, 40 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 6 weeks
later, 15 minutes later, 35 minutes later,
later, 2 months later, 1 hour later,
2 hours later, 5 days later,
a very 5 hours later, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 50 seconds later, 27.32719 seconds later, 4 weeks later, 12 hours later, 347 microseconds later, 30 minutes earlier, 15 minutes later, a half an hour later, 90 minutes later, 1 second later, 31 days later, many moments later, 4 seconds later, 1.5 minutes later, seconds later, 12 hours later, a couple minutes later, 30.1 minutes later, 6.5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, many hours later, a few hours later, 10 minutes later, 2 hours later, 39 minutes later, several hours later, 22 seconds earlier, 5 hours later, 3 hours later, 5.5 minutes later, 99 hours later, 1 fund later, several unproductive hours later, over 10 atoms later, 2 days later, 10 seconds later, the next lap, 3 months later, 50 hours later, 2 hours of travel later, several seconds later, 14 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 days later, many attempts to fix the bell later, 4,000 hours later, earlier that day,
I think one
56
funny video.
seconds
You
later,
didn't see?
7 minutes later,
It's funny.
later that night, a
Funny
couple
seeing the
of
one
ghosts
name.
later, a few hours later, a few moments later,
Why is
the
order
next
guys?
morning, many eternities later, 3 weeks earlier, many miles later, 3 hours later, 2.5 minutes later, later that day, stupid early the next day, 3 hours earlier, 1 hour later, 1 cookie later, a lot of boring math later, numerous minutes later, 8 years later, many questions later, a number of days later, many arguments later, 20.5 minutes later, 15.5 minutes later, 3.9 nanoseconds later, the next morning. Later, 95 seconds later, 2 seconds later, 7 hours ago, 5 seconds later, several
That's me, I'm
hours
left
later,
Spongebob.
1 later,
What's my favorite movie?
7 minutes later, several hours later, 8 minutes later, 7 minutes later, party later, 8 hours earlier,
Spongebob buddy.
a few pants later, a few tic-tacs later, minutes
No, he's
later,
eating bird.
3 minutes later, 5 hours later, 7 minutes later, 60 minutes later, 20 minutes and 30 seconds later,
Again?
2 seconds earlier, a number of hours later, 7 minutes later, 10 sleepless hours later, 3 minutes later, a bit earlier, 1 hour later, 1 scary
And if
road
he's
later,
eating,
limited time only, 8 months later, approximately
He
10
threw
hours
his
later,
food in the garbage.
one stormy long bedroom trip later, 3 hours later, 365 days later, 3 hours later, 15 minutes later, 2,000 years later, 5 hours later, 15 minutes later, 1 minute ago, several hours
Where's my
later,
glasses?
one studio session later, soon after,
Sarah, you see my
soon
glasses?
after again, 19 minutes later, 7 years earlier, 7 days later, 2 hours later, many seconds later, later, 2 hours later, 2 days later, 3 hours later, 2 hours later, 2.5 minutes later, a few moments later, 9 years later, a few hours later, 1 year later, 12 hours later.
Okay.
Zuzutek, historię Zuzutek. Ami, Mako, jak tam Zuzus dojdzie?
So 500 minutes, many attempts to fix the gifts, 9 books, 298 frozen patties, 1,000 of tears, stupid early the next morning, 1 second, a lot of screaming, 90,000 hours of fun term, 15 months, new one. Meanwhile, back in the Monday, tomorrow for right. Power for short. Afternoon 4, afternoon 5, afternoon 6, 1 trillion fireworks later. That the old narrator got tired of waiting, and they had to hire a new one today for right. Today again, 80 minutes seriously, 21 minutes later, after Pinky arrived on the moon. Several song-filled minutes later, 765,000 years later, 2,000 years later, 3 days seriously, a today, very boring. Then a few inches later, after Yaroslav fell asleep on 2:57 a.m., when Pinky and Yaroslav Messi arrived at Red Paint at the Place, after Dennis and Era calling bowling, after Pinky and Wenda calling bowl when bowl will ground her.
1 hour later, 1 week later, 1 hour later, 1 week later.
So 500 minutes,
1 hour later. Several months later. Many exam questions. Several months later. Many exam questions later. The next day. Many hours later.
What?
The next morning. 2 minutes later. Several thousand ripped pants
Not too
later.
much. Shame you.
Not just one, 3 different stains. Removing them is impossible.
Dumb
My dear
you.
dog, goodbye.
But
I
shit,
have
they
Tide
had no mind.
liquid. Impossible
Yes,
to remove
yes.
such stains. With Tide, nothing is impossible.
New Tide Liquid Triple Power is
All is
3
done
times
it.
stronger than ordinary detergents
Bro, make
for
a new
better
game.
cleaning and brightness.
Two extremely annoying hour later.
وعلى بعد أمتار وعلى بعد أمتار.
So we have more SpongeBob time cards as well. In places we forgot something about where go until we reached. Look at the dragon was just question. Get out. So bad and get out. I saw.
What follows is a brief
Look, you have a
construction
nip.
montage.
Yeah, it will do it.
Flashback.
Check out.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. And a flashback. Soon after, montage. Previously, yesterday, meanwhile, Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. Meanwhile, deep in the kelp forest. Meanwhile, back on the Patrick Show. Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
Recording?
A few moments later. A few moments later. A few moments later. Moments later. Moments later. Moments later. Many moments later. Many moments later. Many unbearable moments later. More moments later. A little later.
A little later.
A while later. A little while later. 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 In the void. Later still. Later that evening. Happy friendiversary. Later that same evening. Later that day. Later that day. Later that same whoopsie-doo-doo day. Later that night. Later that night. Later that night. More laterer.
Much later.
Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday, you get the idea. Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 8:01 p.m., 1 nanosecond later, 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 13 seconds later, 47 seconds later, 47 seconds later, a few seconds later, a few seconds later, 1 minute later, 1 minute later,
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier.
1 minute, 37 seconds later, 2 minutes later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 10 minutes later,
10 minutes later.
11 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes ago, 15 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later,
20 minutes later.
a few minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, many minutes later.